Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 42 of the show. While you're listening to this, I'm probably in the middle of moving a whole lot of junk to our new place. My plan is still to record in this coming week, but depending on how things go with setting up my office and finding time, I may end up taking a week off of the show. Also, if things end up sounding a bit more echoey this week, it's because the room I'm recording in is empty. My apologies if it's super noticeable. So let's mix things up this week and be a little bit adventurous by jumping straight into news. This week I stumbled upon yet another article about GameStop, and although the news isn't very happy, I think it's still important to talk about. The article I'm referring to is from David Goldman at CNN Business, who writes about how GameStop has some rough waters ahead of them. The latest news from GameStop is that they will no longer be paying their investors a quarterly dividend. This isn't too much of a surprise given the company's continued difficulties, including a 13% drop in sales for the first quarter of 2019. GameStop's newest CEO, George Sherman, said on Tuesday, "We believe we will transform the business and shape the strategy for GameStop of the future." As someone who doesn't know all the intricate details of the situation, it's pretty hard to see how this business is going to be transformed. I'm not sure what exactly it's going to take to turn this company around, but with game streaming services like Stadia just around the corner, and an overall shift towards more digital purchases, GameStop is going to have a tough journey ahead. It's also really hard having the proper perspective on this whole situation. I'm personally attached to the Game Informer brand, which is obviously part of GameStop, and the thought of them going away is incredibly sad. It's important to remember, for me at least, that the draw to Game Informer isn't their brand, it's the people behind their brand. It's the personalities on the podcast and the editors of the magazine. And I have no doubt that all of them will continue to produce amazing gaming content whether or not Game Informer sticks around. Now before I get too emotional about this whole topic, let's jump into this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Ape Out, which is a top-down, smash-em-up, full of violent and stylized kills. This game was released on February 9th of 2019 and is available on Switch and PC. It was developed primarily by Gabe Cuzzillo, although the art was done by Bennett Foddy, who you might know from Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, and the music was composed by Matt Bach. The only other game that Gabe has released is Foiled, which came out in 2014. Currently, Ape Out costs $14.99 and takes between 2.5 to 3 hours to beat just the main campaign. I personally played this on Switch with my Joy-Cons, and it felt pretty decent to control overall. This is a Twitch-style game where you need to have fast reactions, but outside of the speed for controls, the game is relatively simple. As such, gamepad or mouse and keyboard should all just work fine. Let's move on now to talk about the narrative. I am so f***ing tired of spending my time in this cage, day in and day out. I just want to talk with people and have a chill day. But every time I talk, I get shot in the ass with a tranquilizer. You know what? Today, this ends. I know I look like a cuddly monkey, but today, I am breaking out and going batshit crazy. What's interesting about Ape Out is that the narrative has to be almost completely inferred by the player. There are level titles which sometimes give a bit of context to the stage, but overall this is just a game where you pick it up and play. You're not clicking through dialogue, you're not watching long cutscenes, you're just f***ing shit up. The basic premise is that you're an ape who is caged and is trying to be free. It's pretty simple. Where the story does develop a small amount is in the main locations you visit. The first main place you're trying to break out of is a heavily guarded building in the middle of a jungle. After you do a bunch of levels there, you go to a high-rise. You're trying to escape from the top of a skyscraper. Next, you're trying to get out of a military base. Each new place you go and each new enemy you face provides a bit more context to the state of the world you live in. One thing the story didn't make clear, at least from what I remember, is whether the ape you play is the same ape in each new situation or whether it's a new ape each time. Let's not kid ourselves though. The focus of this game is not on the narrative. And despite that being a legitimate question, whether it's the same ape from place to place, it really has no implication on whether or not the game is good. Since that's the case, let's get into the meat of this game, the gameplay. So we've laid down the groundwork that you're an ape and you're pissed off at humanity, but how do you actually escape these locations? You walk out in a trail of blood. Kinda like Katana Zero, this is another game that gives homage to Hotline Miami. It's top down, bloody, has a retro aesthetic, and many of the enemies are one-hit kill. For the most part, your controls are pretty simple. You can move around, shove people, and you can also grab them and use them as a shield. Let me clarify though, when I say shove, what I really mean is violent pushing that causes someone's body, their entire body, to disintegrate into a pile of blood upon impact with a wall or another person. Also, when I say that you can use someone as a shield, if they're holding a gun, they'll fire their weapons wherever you're pointing. It is pretty freaking brutal. The objective of each level is to reach those beautiful green doors, the checkpoint, or the next level. In some levels, you could probably do so without killing anyone, but as the game goes on, the situations you're presented with become very much a matter of you or them. Since there really isn't a whole lot more to explain about how the gameplay is structured, let's discuss the overall strengths and weaknesses. The first strength is how incredibly satisfying the moment-by-moment action is. When you make it through a level, you feel like a complete badass. You're playing out a 1 against 100 scenario, and when you come out on top, it feels so good. The second strength of gameplay is the pacing. When you spot someone on your screen, you learn to know the exact timing of when they're going to attack, and your range to grab them or shove them is perfectly designed so that if you don't make your decision instantaneously, you'll get hit. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a Twitch-based game. Not Twitch as in streaming, but this is Twitch as in meaning you have to make choices quickly. The early levels take place in pretty well-contained corridors, which limit the angles at which you can be attacked, but as you get into more spread out and open levels, your quick reactions and decision-making becomes even more crucial to your survival. The third main strength lies in the enemy design. Each enemy presents a unique challenge, and as additional enemies are introduced, your choices become much more complex. Let's look at a few examples. First, you have a small office dude who runs away if you chase him. He's a scaredy cat. But if you turn and focus on something else, this guy will get brave, pull out his Glock, and try to start shooting you. Second, there's a kamikaze soldier who has dynamite strapped to his chest. If you get shot while you hold them, they explode. And if you're too close to the wall when you shove them, they also explode and kill you. Third, there are SWAT shotgunners, and these guys do not go down with a single hit. They hurt incredibly badly if you take a shotgun blast up close, and they take a lot more to go down. There are these 3 enemies and many more, which all require different reactions to address properly. If you run into a room with an office worker, SWAT soldier, and kamikaze man, they each need to be dealt with in a unique way. Say you run toward the office worker to keep him from shooting you, chances are that you'll also be taking a spray of pellets to the face. If you start by going for the bomb boy, you better shove him away quickly or you'll explode from him getting shot. If you go to the SWAT guy first, he's going to take a lot of additional time to take down, and while that's happening, you might get shot by Mr. Brave. As you can probably see, it's really through the enemies as well as the map design that this game developed a lot of its nuance. In terms of weaknesses, the main one I found was that some levels have insane spikes in difficulty, which I think could have been smoothed out better. I think it was literally the second level of the game where the kamikaze soldiers were introduced. My issue wasn't with those actual characters though. My problem with that level was the map design. You're placed in a building with tight corners and small corridors, which made the bombermen very difficult to face. If you turn a corner and shove them into the wall, that wall is too close and will kill you right away. If you grab them instead, it's just a death wish since another soldier will shoot and blow you both up. I probably played that level 7 or 8 times, no joke. There also was another level later on where the sheer volume of enemies was ridiculous for how open the space was. Don't get me wrong, there should be a nice ramp of difficulty throughout the game, and I do think that most of the levels were balanced well. It was just that a few specific levels spiked the difficulty, I think, in an unfun way. In conclusion for our gameplay section, Ape Out presented a fast-paced and incredibly satisfying experience overall. Now that we've made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's discuss the art and sound design. On the art side, this game had such a cool look. Bennett used a very minimalistic, top-down perspective which allowed for the colors and blood to really pop. The style it was going for reminded me a lot of that opening credits scene for Monsters, Inc., if you happen to remember that. I know it's kind of a deep cut. It's really one of those things where you have to see it to understand what I'm getting at, but the point is that the art style really fit the experience well. This is a gory as hell game, but it's presented in a very stylized and almost non-offensive way. When it comes to the soundtrack, the way Matt Bach tied it in with the gameplay was incredible. The music was a form of jazz, which is super cool already, but what really took it over the edge was how kills added to the music. Every time you would shove someone up against a wall to smash their skull in, it would create a sound like you were slamming a cymbal or hitting a drum. What's so brilliant is that instead of all these noises becoming disruptive, they actually made the music better. It allowed you to embody the ape in order to take part in his cathartic experience full of killing and frenetic jazz. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art and sound design, let's touch on some overarching positives and negatives of Ape Out. First off, on the positive side, the gameplay was fast-paced, satisfying, and fun. This game is also a wonderful example of how complex mechanics aren't necessary to have an experience that scales in complexity. Second, the art was beautifully minimalistic. Not only is this game satisfying to play, it's nice to look at. I also loved the way the level titles were displayed in creative ways with fun, old-school looking fonts. Third, the way the gameplay influenced the sound design was unique and clever. Jazz not only fit the overall theme, it was the perfect style of music to have the player add to. On the negative side, there was a clear lack of story development. Although that's not necessarily bad, I would have enjoyed at least a little bit more context as to who each ape was and why they were locked up in each of the locations. Second, I think the difficulty curve needed some tuning. Maybe you'll play Ape Out and find it to be perfect, but in my experience, there were just those few levels that felt too difficult when compared to the rest. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. Unless you're only looking for games with complex plots and deep lore, this is a great pickup. Ape Out is creative, stylish, and most importantly, it's fun. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. Thanks for listening to my echoey voice, and I'd like to remind you to not forget to write in with your questions and thoughts to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. And if you like what you hear, go give the show a 5-star review on iTunes. If you're one of those overachievers and have already done that, I would love it if you considered telling a friend about the podcast. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.